Dang it, you, David. Dang it, you, Calvin. I feel like I need to, and I could really, frankly, rewrite this whole message. I think when we look for God and expect the unexpected, I think good things happen. That was not Cohen's faux pas of the wrong intro to the children's message. That was mine. It's not really Abby's faux pas that she's not here this morning. Her mama, her grandma died. And instead of diehard, as I have felt called to proclaim, I want to say diehard as in don't die. Diehard as in he is the way, the truth, and the life. And it's hard to die if you follow the way and the truth and the life. I pretty much doubt that any of you keep track of what's preached Sunday after Sunday after Sunday. But when you're called to the ministry and have the honor, the privilege, the responsibility of carrying the weight of sharing God's love, of preaching the gospel, of proclaiming the word, week in and week out, when the pinnacle, the prime of your week, the single hour, the 60 minutes, the 3,600 seconds that you keep track of what you preached each Sunday, each first day of the week, each Sabbath. And for the last three, the last un, deux, trois, the last trinity of Sundays, we've talked about, we've learned about, we're ingesting bread. The bread that comes from heaven. The living bread that is the way, the truth, and the life. The living bread that uncurls your fingers and in fact your whole body. Without which, as you have shared with me, you probably wouldn't be here. Thanks be to God for the living bread, for being a diehard. Bread is mentioned 390 times in the Bible, 85 times in the New Testament. 20 of those, 1/4 of those, are in the Gospel of John, most of any New Testament book. And of the 20 times that John uses the word bread, 17 of them are right here in the 6th chapter. And 4 of those are preceded with the words, I am. The Hebrew word for bread and food often are used interchangeably, pointing to how foundational bread is to the daily diet. Bread is often referred to as the staff of life because it was something that people leaned on, counted on, required for nutritional support, as a shepherd leans on their staff. The first century Middle Easterners To be without bread was the lowest forms of poverty and was often a metaphor for hopelessness. See, Caroline, thriving through Hebrew is not without importance. But we are not talking about the snowy white, so fluffy that there's more air than substance in it, that we use to make bologna and cheese and peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. No, this bread in the Middle East is today a mainstay of life, even as it was 2,000 years ago. This is tough, grainy, nutritious stuff filled with vitamins and necessary carbohydrates and fiber and free from preservatives. In the time of Jesus, as it is today, the local bread was what we would call a large pita bread, round, about 10 or 18 inches in diameter. An adult man would eat maybe 3 of them in the course of a meal. It was also used to scoop up meat in any stew and clay pots. Flat, unleavened bread. It was dry. It was durable. It was filling. And usually had to be soaked and flavored in olive oil just to make it palatable, just so it didn't taste so bad. By the first century, the Romans had introduced variety and artistry into the Middle Eastern science of bread making. Barley, rye, wheat, corn, and other grains were being used, and leavening, salt, and sugar were making bread lighter, tastier, and more digestible, though it was still far from the bread that we know today. Roman bread was heavy, dense, and grainy. And in both cases, whether we're talking about Roman bread or Middle Eastern bread, it was the staff of life and the mainstay of most people's daily diets, especially those who could not afford meat on a regular basis. They had to sell fish in order to pay for necessities and for fruits and vegetables, which really were rare, and for special occasions and seasonal treats. With bread that important to the daily existence of his audience, is it not surprising that Jesus would choose it as the abiding metaphor for life, his ministry, and his relationship with his followers? And John devotes an entire chapter, chapter 6, 71 verses of his entire gospel to this metaphor. Now, bear with me. Imagine for a second that we didn't have burgers or steakhouses, or even when our food supply chain is disrupted, pretty much anything that we want to eat. Imagine with me if bread was not just some delightful side or something that you sandwiched with meat. Imagine if it was the mainstay of almost every meal. Imagine if bread was 9 times out of 10 the main course of the meal, the primary food from which you received nutrition, nourishment, sustenance. Now think for a moment what happens when you eat that main course? You digest it. It becomes a part of you. You and the bread become one. You are inseparable. It supplies you with nutrients that are necessary for life itself. By eating the bread, you enable it to fulfill its purpose. It is no longer enough to admire Jesus. It's no longer sufficient to use him as a life preserver. It's no longer satisfactory to follow him whenever you have the energy or have gotten enough sleep to do so. We are called beyond all of that to a new level of total commitment. This is not just a good idea. This is not just an ethical road to follow. Jesus is not just your Facebook friend, your Khan Academy professor, your mobile stabilizer, your mobile trailblazer, your moral trailblazer. Do you see how we are called to a radically different way of living and relating to the world around us? It is challenging and demanding. It is expensive and hard. It is scandalous in its implications and downright scary in its requirements. It calls us to question anything we thought we knew and every assumption we ever accepted. It's all put in plain language right there in verse 56. Unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Next to nothing was more objectionable to the first century Jews than breaking the dietary restrictions that were set down in Leviticus. And chief among those was that no human should ever drink blood of any kind or eat human flesh under any circumstances. Even to use human flesh and blood as a metaphor, as Jesus does here, was a horrible breach of decorum, of decency, of that day's understanding of the divine will. And yet, it is the very metaphor that Jesus chooses to show his radical demands. Demands that would be taken up only by diehards. Feel like we need to lighten it up a little bit. So 2 missionaries were going door to door. And a woman answered, and she told them under no circumstances does she want to hear their message. And she slammed the door in their faces. To her surprise, however, the door did not close. In fact, it almost magically bounced back open. She tried again. She really put her back into it. And the door did the same amazing thing. It bounced back again. And convinced that one of these young diehards was sticking their foot in the door, she reared back to give it a third slam. She felt that she would really teach them a lesson. But before she could act, one of them stopped her and politely said, ma'am, before you do that again, you really should move your cat. I know you probably heard that before, but I think it relates. Friends, as uncomfortable as it might make us, a diehard is exactly what Jesus is calling us to be. But not the kind of diehard that knows they're right and everyone else is wrong. Rather, the kind of diehard that knows that they're wrong and how right the living bread is. Not the kind of diehard who stockpiles to fight, to get the upper hand, to win. Rather, the kind of diehard who beats plowshares out of swords to feed the hungry and to promote peace. Not the kind of diehard who loves only those who can help him and wages a holy war on everybody else. Rather, the kind of diehard who loves sacrificially, unconditionally, and non-judgmentally. This, Jesus says, is life lived abundantly. This, Jesus says, is life lived authentically. This, Jesus says, in the Gospel of John, is life lived eternally. Amen? Amen.